And welcome back. We are now going to continue our review of programming by looking at today that of branching statements. Now, when we talk about branching statements, you might recall that in Java, we have two different types of conditional branching. We have the if-else and we have switch statements. Now, both of these are going to do effectively the same kind of action. They're going to look to see if a condition is true and then execute the corresponding code. Now, let's just focus on the if-else portion of that today, and we'll look at switch statements in our next lesson. So, in review, let's start first with just looking at just the if-else, so a basic if-else test. Remember, Java is always going to require us to have at least an if statement. You don't necessarily need that else, but you do need an if. You're going to have, hey, if some condition is true, then do some code. The else statement, on the other hand, will act as kind of a catch-all. So if it doesn't meet a certain condition, the else statement will always be like, hey, this is what I want you to do if you can't do anything else. So we're going to say else and then do some other code underneath it. Now, while else statements are not always required, you will also notice that they don't have any conditions. If you'll see it says condition is true, else doesn't have that. And so that's just one thing to keep in mind when we start writing our else statements, is that they don't require any conditions. Now, if we wanted to branch out further, like let's say we want to test more than pretty much two scenarios, if it is it or if it's not. Well, we can get into using else if. And if you recall with else if we want to test, let's say, more than two conditions, we can use else if statements to test those other conditions. Now, else if will always come after the if, because if is always at the top. But one of the awesome things about else if is that we can have multiple of them. So it allows us to easily test multiple conditions. And an else may or may not follow that final else if. So you could have an if, an else if, an else if, an else if, and you would never need necessarily an else. Because remember, else acts as a catch-all. If you aren't looking for kind of that bucket response or a kind of scenario where an else would be handy, you may not use it. So for example, in here we say, hey, if this condition is true, do some code. Else if this condition is true, do some other code. And of course, like I said, I could do other else if statements on top of that to really keep going and see how many independent situations I want to set up for. Now, these are very cool, but what if, let's say, I want to test two conditions in the same test? So let's say I want to test, let's see if a number is positive, and I also want to see if that number is even. All right, that's two different things, because I'm going to look for two things. Now, I could, of course, nest things. That's also a way to do it, but sometimes we want to do things all in one go. And if I need to test multiple conditions at once, we can use and or to test two conditions. So we can say, hey, if I want to test if a number is positive and it's even, then that would be an and condition. All right, and remember, with an and, both our conditions have to be considered true, otherwise it's false. Now, if I were to switch it around and say it's a positive or it's even, well, now only one of those conditions has to be true, because if both conditions are false, it's false. Otherwise, it's true. So you can see it's just the opposite of what we would have with an and statement. Now, compound statements can be used in both if and else if statements. So we would simply just say if condition is true and condition 2 is true, do some code. And then or, of course, would just be using the same thing, just it would be condition 1 is true or condition 2 is true. All right. And as I already mentioned, you also can still nest things here. So you could put an if statement with inside another if statement. But again, compound statements are a way to kind of really help attack something really quickly. And this can come in really handy especially when we start looking at classes and you want to test multiple pieces of a class to test for things like equality. Now, when we look at comparison operators, there's a whole list of them. And you might recall some of these from Programming 1 course, but let's just review them anyways. So the first batch of comparison operators that we're going to look at, we have less than, greater than, less than or equal to, greater than or equal to, and of course, not equal to. So a pretty self-explanatory group of operators here, but they are not our only ones in the bag. If you recall, we just talked about compound statements. And with the compound ones, we get into using and, we have or. But there's a couple of things I want to make sure that we iterate here. First of all, we are not going to use equals equals when we're comparing objects. And this is a very common one, especially remember with strings. All right, strings, remember, are not variables. They're primitive, like they are in some languages. They are here considered to be objects. So we have to use the dot equals method to compare them. Just like if I were to create, for example, two employee objects or date objects or a dog object, they're probably going to be compared with dot equals because we're testing for equality using an object. Now, if we want to use equals equals, well, that's typically done numerically. So if I have a number and I have another number, great, awesome. So we are typically not going to use equals equals if it's any kind of object unless we want to check to see if they contain the same reference value in memory. So if we were looking to see, like, are they in the same position in memory, we can use equals equals. Otherwise, anytime we deal with any kind of object or any class object, it's always going to be done using dot equals. All right, now over into Eclipse, let's go ahead and just do some conditional testing here just to demonstrate our if, our else if, and of course our else. So I went ahead and created some simple variables here. So I have int num1 is equal to 3, num2 is equal to 4. I just have num3 because I think I'm going to go ahead and use that from user input. I have string input equals an empty string right now, so it's not equal to anything. And I have a sample string called I am a string. So let's go ahead and just do some testing here. So let's say if num1 is greater than num2, we can say just a simple print line statement. And we'll just say num1 is larger. Nothing too complicated. If I want to do a else if, I could say else if num1 is equal to num2. This is a good way to test this. And we could say system.out.println. And maybe this time we want to say the two numbers are equal. And we could just have an else, and we might just say instead that num2 is the larger. All right, so that's a real quick, easy conditional there. And remember, you can, of course, put actual numbers in here. So let's just say I want to add one more condition statement here. So else if, let's just say num1 is, let's go ahead and set that up as greater than, let's say, 5. And we could create something that has a hard value in here. And system.out.println. And we'll just say num1 is greater than 5. All right, we can create as many conditional statements as we want, but what if I wanted to do something with a user input? Well, let's just go ahead and quickly create something that's going to let us test for input. Now I say, please enter a number followed by a string. Because we do have two inputs here that I'm probably going to have to use it because I have this num and I have this input here. So let's just do kb.nextInt. And we need to set that equal to something because otherwise it's not going to store it. So we want to make sure this is num3 equals. And let's also do one for input. So input equals kb.next. And we'll make that a next line just so that we have nice clean carriage return there. All right. Now I could easily come in here and change one of these, for example. And let's say I want to change this from 5 to num3. And I'll make this num3. Now, because I have multiple variables in here now, a better way to test this would be using a compound expression. So maybe I want to see both of these. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy this expression. And maybe I want to see that this is the largest of these numbers. So num1 is the largest number. All right, and that's a real quick, easy way to add a compound expression there. Now, with our string, we do have two strings here, so let's just do an equality test here. So if, let's just say input dot equals sample string, and notice it's really nice and suggested that for me. We're just going to have it print the strings are the same. All right, that looks like a nice, good demonstration of this. Remember, we could also use equals ignore case here, but that's perfectly fine. Let's just go ahead and run our code, and you can see we get our prompt that says enter number followed by string. So let's go ahead and just do 5, and notice it exited right away here. Right? It said number 2 is larger. We never got this input here. So what's if we switch these around? All right, we're just going to switch this around here just to see if we do the line first. And so let's just say I am a string because I want to see if these are actually going to work the same. And 5. All right, so you notice now that I switch those around, remember we had this issue where if you sometimes use next line, sometimes they aren't going to behave the way you expect. So I'm just going to move number and move string. There you go. So we have please enter string followed by number. So now this matches with what I'm doing. So I'm getting an input for a string. I'm getting a number. We notice we get num2 is larger, which means when it went into this conditional here, it looked and see, okay, this one's not true, this one's not true, this one's not true, or this one is, it actually has to be true because this is else. So again, num1 is num1 greater than num2? No. 3 is not greater than 4. Is num1 equal to num2? No. Is num1 greater than num2? Well, yes. This is, again, the same things with here. So that's false. Num1 is greater than num3. That's also false. All right. So it has to go into this else statement. And then, of course, we get the strings are the same because we made that exactly the same input. If I went ahead and change that, though, and I just changed, let's say, one case there, I am a string with a capital S, and let's just go ahead and do 5 again. You'll notice that we have no output now for this because we only have this if here. All right. If I wanted to put something else here that maybe says a different statement for if they aren't the same, I would have to add that onto the end.